A single injection. That is all it took to change a hospital ward into a crime scene that would stay buried for 42 years. In a locked research wing, patients were told they were receiving vitamins. They were not. What entered their bloodstream that night was something no ethics board had approved, something no consent form ever mentioned. Somewhere in a filing cabinet, marked confidential, sat the real name for what they were given. An experimental compound, untested on humans, unimaginable in its risk, and buried under a label designed to keep it that way. The scientists who authorized it were not monsters in the way we imagine monsters. They were brilliant, respected, convinced that the ends would justify the means. They believed they were saving the future by sacrificing the present. Patients began reporting symptoms no one could explain. Fevers that would not break, memory that would not return, children born years later carrying damage no one warned their parents about. And when families asked questions, they were met with silence, or worse, with reassurance. This is the story of the experiment that was never supposed to be found, and the decision, made in a single afternoon, that quietly altered thousands of lives forever. What happens when the people meant to protect you become the danger itself? To understand how it happened, you have to go back to a moment when science felt limitless. A new era of discovery had just begun, and with it came a dangerous kind of confidence. The belief that progress could outrun caution. Research facilities operated with almost no outside oversight, and the committees meant to question them were often funded by the very people they were supposed to police. Behind closed doors, a small team of researchers convinced themselves they had found something extraordinary, a treatment that could reshape medicine itself and secure their names in history. But there was a problem. It had never been tested safely. Animal trials were incomplete. Early results were inconsistent, sometimes fatal, and quietly excluded from the reports sent upward. Rather than slow down, the team made a choice that would echo for generations. They moved to human trials in secret, selecting patients who were vulnerable, uninformed, and unlikely to be believed if they ever spoke out. The elderly, the poor, those in psychiatric care, people whose voices, by design, carried no weight in a system built to ignore them. Internal memos from the period, later uncovered, describe the subjects not as patients, but as material, not as people, but as data points in a ledger of ambition. For years, everything appeared to be running smoothly. Reports were filed, funding continued, careers advanced, and awards were handed out. But behind the polished paperwork, something had already gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, and no one outside that room knew it yet. Then, one clerk, filing routine hospital records, noticed a pattern that should never have existed. The pattern was simple, and it was devastating. Patients who had received the vitamin injections were dying at nearly triple the rate of those who had not, and the deaths clustered in ways no natural illness ever does. The clerk cross-referenced names, dates, dosages, and realized the deaths were not random. They followed the experiment's timeline exactly, ward by ward, month by month. When the compound was finally analyzed independently, years after it entered human bodies, scientists discovered it had never been intended for safe use at all. It was a byproduct of unrelated military-adjacent research, untested, unstable, and capable of causing permanent neurological and reproductive damage. The horror deepened with every document uncovered, each folder revealing a layer investigators had not expected. Survivors described violent headaches, seizures, and a creeping loss of memory that stole years from their lives before anyone explained why. Some described entire weeks vanishing from their minds, never to return. Then came the detail that changed everything. Internal correspondence proved the lead researchers already knew, less than 1 year into the trials, that patients were being harmed, and they continued anyway. One handwritten note, found decades later in a sealed archive, read simply, Continue. Results still valuable. 4 words. Thousands of lives. Women who took part in related trials later learned their children carried genetic abnormalities traced directly back to the exposure. A second generation paying for a decision they never made, in a room they were never allowed to enter. Investigators eventually confirmed what many had feared, but could not prove. This was not a mistake, an accident, or an oversight. It was a calculated risk, taken by men who believed they would never be caught, and who very nearly weren't. For nearly 4 decades, the truth sat buried beneath false diagnoses, sealed files, missing paperwork, and quiet payoffs to families too frightened or too powerless to fight back. When the truth finally surfaced, it arrived not through confession, but through investigative journalists who refused to let the paper trail go cold. Public outrage followed almost instantly. Congressional-style hearings were convened, and for the first time in decades, the survivors were finally handed a microphone instead of a case file. Survivors, some now elderly, testified about symptoms they had carried in silence for decades, never knowing the true cause. A handful of researchers faced formal inquiry. Fewer still faced any real consequence. Several had already died peacefully, with honors intact, their names still printed on university buildings and medical awards. Only one senior scientist was ever stripped of a professional license, a punishment survivors called, bluntly, an insult measured against a lifetime of suffering. Financial settlements were eventually paid, quietly, without public apology, but no amount of compensation could return the years, the memories, or the children born with conditions no family had been warned about. What makes this history impossible to look away from is how familiar its warning signs remain. Today, similar pressures still exist. The race for medical breakthroughs, the temptation to bypass consent in the name of speed, vulnerable populations still disproportionately used in under-regulated trials around the world. The infrastructure of oversight exists now largely because of cases like this one, because regulators were forced, reluctantly, to admit that ambition without accountability is its own kind of weapon. And yet, ethics boards continue to uncover smaller, quieter versions of the same story. In laboratories most of us will never hear about, hidden behind consent forms nobody reads. The lesson was paid for in irreversible damage. And we are still deciding, even now, whether we actually learned it. Every era believes its own ambition is different, safer, smarter, justified by the good it promises to deliver. But history keeps proving otherwise. Power unchecked by conscience does not build the future. It quietly consumes the people standing closest to it. The scientists in this story were not uniquely evil. They were ordinary people, convinced that silence was smaller than progress, until silence became the only inheritance they left behind. That is the terrifying part. This was not an anomaly. It was a warning. Somewhere, right now, in a building that looks perfectly ordinary, a similar decision is being made behind a closed door, justified by someone who believes they will never be questioned. So we have to ask ourselves what we're willing to look away from in exchange for progress we're told we need. If this story unsettled you the way it should, tell us, in the comments, what part of it you cannot stop thinking about. And if you believe these buried histories deserve to be dragged into the light, subscribe, because the next one is still waiting to be uncovered.